When you take a glance at it, Evil Diary looks pretty basic, but something about it caught my eye. It could have been the retro-styled graphics or because in one image I saw the playable character shooting at a zombie. Seeing as how I love horror and the game's key was offered to me, I decided to give it a try. Evil Diary is a horror game, so it wasn't a surprise to see a spooky menu screen. The options it had to offer were pretty bare bones, but that really wasn't a big deal. What started to draw me in some more was the game's intro cutscene. It was more like text appearing on screen, but it still stood out to me. I started to think if Evil Diary was vaguely influenced by Resident Evil 3. I could be wrong, and it turns out that the Resident Evil games were a huge influence on Evil Diary, but at that point that was still up in the air. Generally, it was the tone of the text and the story it was laying out. It reminded me of Jill's desperation to get out of Raccoon City. It wasn't just with how the voice actor came off, but also because of the words that were used. When I started to see words that resembled when Jill said something like, "I have to get out of here," and "This is my last escape," I started to think more of Evil Diary. I realized that stating that a game has simple mechanics may make some think it's bad or something, but that's not true. There are some games out there that have incredibly simple mechanics, but complex actions can still end up being pulled off the more familiarized you become with them. Since it was easy to play, Evil Diary had to spice things up in another way. Initially, this was through the different enemy spawn rates. Some were slow, some were fast, and some were more towards the middle. I eventually realized that this came off as rhythm elements. As a result of that, it was easy to start to recognize patterns and more or less be on top of things to the point where they came off as easy. Evil Diary came off that way for the first 10 minutes or so, but it eventually started to slowly add more. Before long, Evil Diary made use of Fog of War. Due to that, it was harder to time when the enemies would come out/get to me. It also didn't help that by this point there was an increase in enemies, so that made things harder to manage. It wasn't just the enemy spawn rate that was timed. The same concept was used with the sword and pistol, the two main weapons. There were pros and cons to this. The pistol could be used at different distances, whereas the sword was meant for close-range combat. I did, however, start to think if the sword itself wasn't what damaged enemies, but an energy blast that comes out as a result of the sword being swung. It's possible that the sword itself and this blast are two sides of the same coin, but while playing I really didn't look into this. All I knew was that when monsters were up close and personal, it was time to bust out the sword. Evil Diary is a game that did a lot with a little. It was clear that most levels required you to kill a certain number of enemies before you could move on to the next one, but at one point that changed. Besides the enemy kill count, there were also levels where I'd have to wait for an elevator. Its slow countdown helped create tension in a different way. As if knowing that there wasn't a certain number of enemies I had to kill wasn't bad enough, I had to survive for as long as I could, knowing that there was a possibility of being overwhelmed by monsters. That previously wasn't an issue because even if there were still monsters on screen, once I hit the level's required number of enemies killed, the game would move on. With the timed levels, it was more about worrying how much I'd have to put up with for X amount of time. I liked that because it pushed you out of a comfort zone. At first, I thought that all I had to do was look out for enemies in two directions. There are games out there where that's all you can really do, but they still manage to spice things up, like One Finger Death Punch. That changed once bats were introduced. They started to come down the screen, and as a result of that, they introduced verticality to the game. This new enemy type made me realize that I had to be more alert, but simply keeping my eyes open and blindly marching ahead wasn't enough. At one point, Evil Diary started to include obstacles and permanent enemies. Rather than being able to destroy either of those things, you had to maneuver around them, and that was another thing to look out for. This change was noticeable due to being unable to freely move around. Evil Diary eventually started to feature wider levels, and that open space helped, but at times it didn't help that they had more enemies. By this point, it's fair to say that if I needed to sum up Evil Diary in a few words, they'd be more, and more. This wasn't challenging to the point of rage quitting, but it made me realize that I couldn't just breeze through it. Evil Diary definitely keeps you on your toes by throwing more things to overcome, but it also wasn't unfair. Pretty early on, Evil Diary makes use of power-ups that would appear before you. I initially didn't know what some of them did, but after a while I started to pick up on things. It helped that two of the first power-ups that appeared healed you and killed all on-screen enemies, or those that were simply close to you. Besides offering a helping hand, the power-ups created more ways to score. From some of the power-ups that you picked up, you'd start to amass money. From other ones, you got a higher score. Alongside that, there was also how much time you spent on a level. It's not as if you're actively competing against others, but it's nice to know that these elements were part of Evil Diary because they helped a fairly basic looking game offer more. Back when I was a kid, friends and I would make up rules to spice up a game. If we were playing WWF No Mercy, we'd say that we couldn't use finishers or we had to stay in the ring. These self-imposed rules help make an already great game even greater. I know that WWF No Mercy wasn't the first game that could be played in such a way, but it's a reminder that games don't have to be totally explicit with how they can be played. I know I've said this before, but some of the most fun I've had with games is thanks to playing in ways that probably weren't thought of during development. I may be making a mountain out of a molehill here, but it goes to show that Evil Diary does a lot with a little. I was eventually surprised to see that Evil Diary had a final boss/level. I figured it would be more of what the game had served up to me, so the final boss/level came off as a bit abrupt. The final boss was harder than what I previously encountered, but that's not really a surprise. It was harder and I'm pretty sure it took me around 3 attempts, but it generally wasn't anything too difficult to deal with. Overall, you could sum up Evil Diary in that way, not difficult to deal with. Evil Diary isn't a game packed with content, so I wasn't surprised when I beat it in under an hour. I realize that hearing that may make some people not want to play Evil Diary, but I still had fun. It doesn't offer much replayability and it's like a toned down Vampire Survivors with limits, but I know that others will still manage to have fun. I could see this being played by people during the commute to work. Seeing as how it's less than $5, I'd say you get your money's worth. It's nothing like Terraria, which is a game that features a massive amount of content when compared to its cost, but Terraria is an outlier. I didn't think Evil Diary is an amazing game, but at the same time, it offered more than I thought it would, and I had fun. If thinking that a game being too short or basic when it comes to its visuals and gameplay is bad, then I'd say Evil Diary isn't for you. If what you see stands out to you, feel free to give it a try. Can a game be under an hour and still be considered good? Is there a minimum amount of playtime that you want to get out of a game? Are you the kind of gamer that comes up with different ways of playing a game? If you enjoyed this content, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, share, and if you're up for it, become a patron. Thank you very much for watching.